Alrighty, welcome to another episode of the Practical. I'm starting to sound like somebody who's doing like DJ stuff. Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Um, Man, it's been what, a couple of weeks since the past Data Community Summit, um, and then the Thanksgiving in the United States, and finally me getting settled down and getting ready for the holidays. But I've been taking notes as to some of the conversations I've had with people who attended the summit. Uh, Getting caught up with people that I haven't met in years. So that for me was something. It's a little bit weird because when people started. Um, doing virtual events and then finally getting back into on-person events. I'm still cautious as far as interacting with people face to face, and of course trying to be as safe and as healthy as I possibly can. But a lot of those conversations um, have I was looking at some of my notes. I was going back to some of the conversations that I've had, and the topic of today's and I did it a little bit more of a presentation type. The topic of today's episode is eliminating the headaches of upgrading and migrating your SQL Server databases. Last month at the past Data Community Summit, Microsoft announced general availability of SQL Server 2022. Yes, it's there, it's out. You can test it, you can install it, you can run it on production. It's available. But it, it's also interesting because part of modernizing your data infrastructures, your databases, because again, we're not just talking about databases here, but anything that you would leverage for your data platform is a constant consideration for things like I need to upgrade and I need to migrate all of my infrastructures. And I want to make sure that I'm ready with my slide deck. There we go. So, um, and I took this topic based on the conversations that I've had with the people who are attending, a couple of my contacts, where they're moving from an older version of SQL Server, something that's no longer supported, like a SQL Server 2005, and modernizing it, upgrading it, migrating it to a later version, whatever is a supported version that they could run with their either line of business applications or anything that they would need in order to fully support their applications together with their database platform. That's why I wanted to share this. And I've done this presentation before. In fact, I started doing this back in 2008 at one of the Microsoft events here in Canada. And it's interesting because the themes remain the same, meaning the underlying concepts, the principles remain the same. It's the strategies that evolved throughout the years, given how the data platform space has evolved, the available tools, the feature sets, and also the way that the entire industry has evolved with stuff like DevOps and automation and all of these technologies that um, have been introduced together with the approach. The approach remains the same, but it's the fact that as we are looking at modern technologies, modern um, tools, like back then, I remember back then, uh, we were not even talking about the cloud. And back then we called it SQL Azure. Uh, there was Windows Azure and then SQL Azure. Now it's Azure SQL Database or SQL Server on Azure VMs or Azure SQL MI. So even that, the availability of the platforms where you want to move into has evolved to consider a lot of these things. And why don't I start sharing my screen? That way you could start seeing it and I can go ahead and move on with this. All right. Oops. Let's see. There we go. And hopefully you can see my screen now, right? Eliminating headaches of upgrading and migrating your SQL Server databases. And um, I wanted to uh, kind of draw some parallels between moving to a different country or migrating For instance, like in my case, I originally come from the Philippines and moving to initially in Singapore and moving to Canada. It's a totally different experience, and I kind of liken the way we move databases from your current state, whatever version, whatever platform you're using, to a different platform, kind of like immigration in some aspects. If you're the only person moving, right? It's just you, you're single, you don't have a family. All you have to care about is yourself. You think about, your clothes. Of course, you're not going to take your house with you because who does that? Well, I don't know. Maybe some people would do that. Take their entire house, move it overseas. But if you're single and you're the only person who needs to move, you only have to take care of yourself. You only have to think about yourself, your stuff, the things that matter to you, your documents, your ID, everything. You bring it with you, take your luggage, and then fly off to a new country. It's completely different when you're dealing with other people that you have to move with. Let's say you're a family of four, you have to think about not just yourself, but also their concerns. And part of that is also anything that would affect everybody you'll be moving with. Like, for instance, like I said, if you have a family and you're moving overseas, you're moving to a different country or even to a different city, you have to take care of yourself and your family alongside with all of the stuff that they have. So if your kids have toys, if your kids have their own documents, of course, I would assume that they have their own passports, their immigration documents. You have to take care of that because they cannot take care of it themselves, right? Especially if they're, um, you know, below the age of, adult, being an adult. You have to take care of that. And like I said, the way I look at database migrations or upgrades is no different because we're not just looking at databases here. There are four considerations that I look at whenever I'm looking at database upgrade and migration, right? And I kind of look at it in what I call an upgrade and migration project timeline. So you got your timeline here, and I splice it up into different sections. The first section is the pre-upgrade migration. This is where you start planning whatever it is that you need in order to move from your old database platform to the new one. So this is where you gather all of the members of the team who needs to be a part of this. And I always tell my customers the database is not an island, meaning if you're moving to a totally different platform, a totally different version, you got to consider everything else that's connected to it. Your network, your applications, other things that have to connect to that database. If you're doing an ETL process, you have to consider that as well, right? If another database platform, let's say an Oracle database, needs to connect to this for data replication, you have to consider that. So this is the stage where you have to prepare the migration stuff, anything that you have to do during the cutover. This second stage is what I call the actual migration or the actual upgrade process. What you did in phase one, you come up with a project plan, you do it a couple of times, that way you know exactly what to expect, and document the things that you would discover as part of this, and then you schedule a cutover, kind of like a maintenance window, and then you do exactly what's on the plan. I've got tons and tons of interactions with customers where it's like having a script and then going outside of the script and then realizing how come we had this kind of issue. But this is where you actually put your project plan into action. And that's why you need to bring people in. You need to include different teams and people from different teams in order for, even in the pre-upgrade and pre-migration stage, because you want them to be aware of what is going on, what is happening, what their responsibilities are as part of this whole upgrade and migration project, so that when the time comes, right, stage two, where you're actually doing it, assuming, of course, that you've documented everything, is people are ready to step in. I remember at one point we were upgrading it was a failover cluster, and the storage engineers, the network engineers, the active directory guys need to be there, but then realizing that the vendor was not involved in the process, right? We're migrating the storage. So the storage vendor needs to be aware of what is the process, but then there was not enough time for us to move forward because SQL Server was not coming up, and they had to step back and say, "Hey, you guys take care of this. We don't know what to do." Right? But that's mainly because they did not prepare, and ironically, we were just there on standby. We kind of know what to do, but we were not given some heads up on what the project plan looks like. So like, let's just come in there and be standby because we don't know what to expect. We just came there prepared, but again, not knowing what to do. Right? After you've done your actual upgrade and migration, there's this third phase, what I call the post-upgrade or the post-migration phase, where you're looking at everything that you've considered in phase one, meaning the pre-upgrade or pre-migration stage, and you start looking at some of the things that may impact operations. Because even if you do everything that you planned in stage one and carry that over as you do the actual upgrade or migration, there might be some things that you have not considered, right? Because again, you can only plan so much and you cannot anticipate everything. That's just the reality. And this is where you start looking at, did we carry over some of the SQL Server agent jobs? This is one example. Did we carry over the SQL Server agent jobs properly? Did we turn on auditing if we have that enabled? Did we configure everything that we need to configure to make it look like it's the same environment? And then finally, the stabilization phase, right? This is where business as usual, we've cut over to production, and now we're ready to let people in or let applications in, let transactions in. But in the process, you're also monitoring how this entire thing would behave. Because like I said earlier, you can't really anticipate everything. You can only do so much based on experience, based on someone else's input. But again, every upgrade is different, every environment is different, so there might be some parameters, there might be some configuration settings that you forgot because it wasn't documented in the past. So now you're trying to figure out what those are, but that's also part of the stabilization phase. In fact, this is one of my strategies. One reason why I never do an in-place upgrade, and I'm just going to throw it out there. I never do an in-place upgrade mainly because my responsibility is to minimize the risk. And every time I'm having conversations with clients, whether you're implementing a high availability solution or something like this where you're upgrading or migrating, my responsibility is to minimize the risk. And so everything that I'm going to do in the pre-upgrade up to the stabilization phase is all about minimizing the risk while achieving the goal, right? It's twofold. You got to achieve the goal, which in this case is upgrade and migration. But on the flip side, I need to make sure that we're minimizing the risk. And that's why I said I'd never do. Yes, experience has taught me so much that when you're upgrading, doing an in-place upgrade, there is no going back. So you got to be ready to do a rollback just in case. But again, it's part of risk mitigation. But even if you've considered everything within your entire project, your timeline, and all of these things, well, the reality is there's I can't even pronounce it, Hofstadter's, whatever, that it always takes longer than you expect. So even if you plan something, and it's one of the reasons why you have to prepare as early as possible. You have to create a plan, test the plan, iterate it while making sure that it is not affecting production, so that when you do the production cutover to the new environment, that it is successful while at the same time minimizing the risk. Okay, so there are four things that I've seen in the years that I've been working with database upgrade and migration projects. There are four things, four pillars that I see that that are the main challenges with database upgrade and migration. Okay, and you can use this as a pattern, a framework for when you start doing your own database migration and upgrades. And even so, when in my case, because I specialize in high availability and disaster recovery, This is even more critical because the more highly available an infrastructure is, the more complex it becomes. And so even with the database upgrade and migration process, I have to keep all these four in mind, while at the same time, like what I mentioned earlier, minimizing the risk. The first one is the destination. You have your source, could be a SQL 2005 machine running on Windows Server 2008. Doesn't matter, physical machine, virtual machine, doesn't matter. But the destination is the first thing that you need to consider. And in this case, I kind of asked the question, are you moving into a physical environment or a virtual one? Maybe you still have bare metal machines running your databases. If you're moving into a physical environment, there's so many things that you have to consider. You got to buy the equipment. You got to make sure that the equipment is uh, enough to cater to not just the existing workload, but also to future workloads, right? This is where you start looking at baselining your hardware. This is where you start looking at making sure you're provisioning the hardware properly, in addition to making sure that your drivers are there, your apps that need to be in the platform. Like for instance, if you're looking at connecting to a storage area network, that the drivers and the firmwares for uh, the adapters, the HBA cards, anything that you need to carry over to the new environment has to be considered. It's one of the reasons why 74% of server workloads nowadays are running in a virtual environment. No, I didn't make that up. It's from a research that I did. Because if you're moving to a physical environment, you have to consider all of these things that I just mentioned. Not to mention, of course, how sure are you that the hardware is going to get there in time? How sure are you that they're the right components and all of that? But if you already have a virtualized environment where the hardware is already there, you have the virtualization platform, then all you have to do is just create a new VM, right? And that's also part of the consideration is, like I said, back in those days, your option is either moving from physical to physical or physical to virtual. But now you also have the option to move to the cloud. I call it buying versus renting, right? Do you move from on-premises to on-premises virtual or on-premises to the cloud? And I'm not just talking about doing a lift and shift, because I see a lot of customers do lift and shift where they'll take their existing infrastructure, move it to the cloud, and do exactly what they have in there. Because this is the common mistake that a lot of people make when they're dealing with an upgrade and a migration project, thinking, hey, my destination should look exactly like my source. So they decide they want to move to the cloud, but then on premises, they have a 3-node Windows Server failover cluster with a 3 replica availability group. And now when they move to the cloud, they're thinking, how come my bill is like this? It's so expensive, right? This is a main consideration, because this could also be an opportunity for you to start reevaluating your workload, reevaluating your databases, so that you can modernize it and not even do a lift and shift, but rather consider something like, okay, can we put the database in an Azure SQL DB or an Amazon RDS SQL Server? Again, not leaning towards just Microsoft stuff, but also AWS, or is the only option for me to move from on-premises to SQL Server on Azure VMs, or SQL Server on AWS EC2 instances? That is part of the things that you need to consider when you're moving to a totally different destination. And of course, back then there were some limitations about, hey, I want to move my database from on-premises full-blown boxed SQL Server product to Azure SQL DB. And so Microsoft came up with Azure SQL managed instance, where you can now start looking at, hey, maybe I can move my databases over to Azure SQL MI and not pay for a full-blown Azure SQL VM, but also not be restricted by Azure SQL DB. So there's that thing in the middle where you can migrate. And again, this is the first consideration. It's the destination, right? Think about that. Are you moving from physical to physical, or are you moving from physical to virtual? And if that's the case, are you moving from on-premises to cloud, or to an extent, because you're already preparing for it, right? Stage one, the pre-upgrade and pre-migration stage in the upgrade and migration timeline is thinking about maybe we can modernize our database so that we no longer have to worry about full-blown VM where we have to take care of the patching, security, and whatnot, but move the databases over to Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL MI or Amazon RDS. Okay, and that's the thing. When you have to consider your migration, the first consideration is your destination, right? What's the second one? The second one is the content. And I'm not just talking about the data in the database, right? The way I look at it is I take it a level higher outside of SQL Server, right? Because part of the content is, for me, I'm looking at both the database and SQL Server. I've seen customers where they want to migrate their SQL Server databases, but they want to keep, or upgrade their SQL Server databases, but they want to keep their Windows versions the same. Not a big fan of that because, for one, you're going to upgrade your operating system anyway down the road, but the timing is very important, right? The timing is very important because here's the thing. If you're simply moving your databases, your SQL Server versions from, let's say, SQL 2005 to SQL whatever, you need to take into account the version of Windows that specific version of SQL Server needs to run on, right? I've taken the screenshot from the Microsoft Docs website where you're looking at the supported versions of Windows that SQL Server 2022 supports. But in addition to that, it's also thinking about, hey, going back to the destination consideration, right? The first thing is if I'm moving from physical to another physical, you have to consider the end of life of your hardware. Are we going to do a hardware refresh? Are we going to do, or is this a brand new hardware, but they're still running older versions of Windows? Because I've seen cases where, it's a brand new hardware, but the vendor, had it in the inventory for quite a while. They're running Windows Server 2019, yet we already have Windows Server 2022, right? So that's also going to be part of your consideration. And in my case, this is something that I keep telling my customers. I don't get any commissions for recommending the latest and the greatest versions of either Windows or SQL Server. I wish I did. 1% of, even 0.5% commission for selling Microsoft. I'll be happy for that. Thank you, Microsoft. But the thing is this, it's never about me getting a commission, because I wish, but it's also about supportability. And like I said in the beginning, when I'm doing migration, I'm there are two goals. The goal is to successfully upgrade and migrate the database, but also to minimize the risk. Part of that risk is, how is this going to impact supportability down the road if you're going to install Windows Server 2016 running SQL Server 2019 or SQL Server 2022? Right? And keep in mind, the Windows and SQL Server have different end of life dates, right? Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2 will be next year, whereas SQL Server 2012 already had its end of life or mainstream support well, not early, but middle of this year. Can't believe it's December already. But the thing is this, you also have to factor that in, right? Making sure that you're not moving to a version of both SQL and Windows that could potentially be their end of life within the next 2 years. Because you've seen how much time, how much effort, how much resource this will take, and you're telling me we're doing it again in 2 years? Maybe not. So that's part of the consideration, right? The third one is identification. Oh, by the way, going back to this, one of the key things that you also need to think about is application support. I'm going to talk about that later, but application support, meaning it's not just the application knowing that when you move the database, it's as if nothing happened. It will keep functioning the way it needs to function. There's no breaking changes. Like, how I remember back when, I think it was SQL Server 2014, where the query optimizer changed, and then we moved a couple of databases, all of a sudden applications started misbehaving, and it's because the application was not tested on the new cardinality estimation and the new query optimizer. So kind of like that, especially when you're dealing with third-party applications where, well, I can't really do much on the database side unless it is officially stamped, validated, and officially supported by the third-party vendor, right? I've had cases where we can't move to the latest and the greatest. We can't even move to one version lower. So we're talking about SQL Server 2022 here. We can't even move to SQL Server 2019 because the vendor only supports the database. I mean, the application vendor only supports the database running on SQL Server 2014. So imagine that I'm on SQL 2005. I want to move to SQL Server 2014. And if you look at the end of the life for mainstream support for SQL Server 2014, it's going to be a couple of years. You telling me I'm going to put in a lot of effort, a lot of my resources, a lot of my time into moving into this new platform, and you're telling me I'm going to do it again because I'm going to be out of mainstream support within a couple of years. And that's part of the way I do my risk assessment is I don't want to do this again within the next 2 years. And of course, even with the way that Microsoft is releasing version after versions, I don't even recommend moving to the next version immediately because I just spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of manpower into moving into this new version. You're telling me to do it? No, it doesn't make sense. So sometimes I would even recommend customers to skip one version because you also want to calculate the return on their effort, return on their investment in terms of time, money, and resources. Plus, again, if you're dealing with third-party applications, you still need to make sure that the third-party vendor can support that version that you're moving into, right? And again, sometimes your hands are tied. You cannot move to the latest and the greatest. Of course, we technical professionals have our own reasons for why we want to move to the latest and the greatest because, hey, we can put it on our resume and say, hey, I've worked with SQL Server 2022. Yeah, but again, it's all about successfully upgrading, migrating while minimizing the risks. The third consideration, so we talked about destination, we talked about the content, and I'm not just talking about the data. We're looking at both SQL Server or the database version, and the operating system as well, right? Good thing about platform as a service offerings like Azure SQL MI and SQL Server, Azure SQL DB, you don't have to worry about the operating system. And you also don't have to worry about versions because, underneath it's just doing its own upgrade. And that's one of the main considerations for moving to the cloud. Part of the destination consideration is moving to the cloud and reevaluating your workload. I know I'm going back to this because it's the one thing that most people don't recognize that you can do, because in the past they've all done a lift and shift. We take this workload, move it to the new environment. Same old crap as everything that they've done in the past. But again, you now have the choice to move to a platform as a service offering like Azure SQL DB or AWS, Amazon RDS for SQL Server, or Azure SQL MI. The third one is identification. And I'm not just talking about security and identity as part of this, right? Because we have to consider that, right? Your application connects to your database. You have your identity. You have your credentials and permissions, sure. But again, I'm looking at it above that level. It's not just about identification where we're looking at credentials, permissions, ACLs. I'm taking it a level higher and looking at applications recognizing the database. What do I mean by this? So imagine, and again, I'm simply using a diagram here where your application would connect to your source, meaning the old version of your SQL Server, your databases. Your application would connect to the database given the specified connection string. Your server name is sales, your database name is salesDB with your proper credentials. And again, we are going above the identity piece where you're looking at credentials, login, passwords, identity, permissions. Again, way beyond that, way above that. When I start moving my database over from my source, maybe to SQL Server 2005 to SQL Server 2019, running Windows Server 2019, or even to the cloud, After the migration, remember what I showed you in the upgrade and migration project timeline. When you've done the migration, the actual upgrade and migration, where you're doing the post migration tasks, I want to make sure that my application, given that I don't touch it, I don't mess with it, it will still function the way it functioned, the way it worked before the entire migration happened. Meaning, I don't have to change anything. No change to the application, no change to the connection string, nothing. How I look at this is it should be transparent, meaning the application doesn't even know that something happened, right? Because, like I said, part of this is minimizing risk. You're moving from one version of SQL Server to another version of SQL Server, from one operating system to a new operating system, from one platform to a new platform. Again, could be physical to virtual or virtual to cloud, but the application should not even know that something ever happened. Okay, I want to minimize that risk, because when the application can no longer connect because it cannot be redirected properly, or the application needs to be rewritten because it's not taking advantage of all the or the behavior is completely different now that the functionality is different and uh, everything else changed, then that's a risk that I now have to consider. And part of that is also downtime, which I would lead into later, right? Making sure that identification, the client application doesn't even know that an upgrade happened. If you can do that, way better. Okay. And this is, again, you can do all sorts of different stuff in this, but again, the overall goal is to make sure that the client application doesn't even know that something happened, right? No changes, nothing. The most common thing that I see people do is they would change the connection string, like in this case, change the server name to point to the right destination. Because again, you could name the source as server 1, your new destination is server 2, then of course you have to change your connection string. But like I said, that's as much as I want to tolerate, because I cannot afford to rewrite the entire application just because we migrated. Now, a complete rewrite of the application is a totally different project. This is just an upgrade and a data migration project we're talking about here. Okay. In addition to that, okay, like I said, the client application should get redirected automatically without changing connection strings, without major changes to the application, and feels like nothing's changed from the point of view of the application. In addition to that, I've already hinted this, where the client application needs to be compatible with a version of SQL Server that you are moving into, right? This is where you start looking at deprecated features. What are the features that my application is using that no longer exist in this later version, right? Being in the high availability space, one of the most common things that I see is that client applications are leveraging database mirroring in the past, and while database mirroring is still supported, it's already deprecated. So you have to start thinking about, what can I use to replace something like database mirroring, or other features that have been deprecated that are no longer being improved in later versions. So that's something that you also need to consider, in addition to, again, application compatibility. And not just application compatibility from our point of view, but also from support point of view. And I keep emphasizing this, that I mentioned earlier. I may be able to upgrade to the latest and greatest version of SQL Server, but if my vendor is not going to support it, well, my hands are tied, right? And moving to a totally different application does not happen overnight. You got to do a lot of planning. And so that's one thing. In addition to application compatibility, like, will my application still behave the way it needs to behave prior to the upgrade? But also understanding that, hey, my vendor might not support this version of SQL Server, and I may have no other choice but to go 2 versions lower. So I might be on SQL Server 2017, even though SQL Server 2022 is already available, right? So we have the destination, we have the content, we have identification, and of course, my key area of expertise, availability. Because as I mentioned earlier, I have two goals every time I do an upgrade in a migration project, is to make it as successful as I possibly can while minimizing the risk. Part of the risk is downtime. If this is a mission critical database, I want to make sure that it's not going to take 4 hours or 2 days to do the entire migration if my allowable downtime is 4 hours. If my allowable downtime is 4 hours, I need to make sure that I don't take longer than that. And that's one of the reasons why the pre-upgrade and migration phase is very important, because now you can test, you can document, you can time, and then you have some wiggle room around, okay, we got 4 hour downtime. We managed to do this in 2.5 hours. There's 1.5 hour, if my math is correct. I have an hour and a half wiggle room, maybe to take into account the things that I never anticipated. So I still have 1.5 hours. And then part of that is also rolling back in case when you're cutting close to your allowable downtime and you haven't really made any progress, then you have to factor in rollback time. Okay, it is going back to the definition of your recovery point objective, your recovery time objective, and your SLAs, or OLAs, the operating level agreements. It is going back to these. That's why part of the planning phase, and I keep going back to the upgrade and migration timeline, in stage one, where you're doing your pre-upgrade, your pre-migration task, you have to take into account, what is my allowable downtime? You can't take your time on this. I wouldn't want to take my time on this, especially if it's going to happen on a weekend. I want my life. I want to be able to do stuff that I want to do over the weekend and not just take care of this entire migration project while not sure how long is it going to take. And that's why defining your recovery point, recovery time objectives give you a working timeline of what is allowable. And while you're doing your pre-upgrade and pre-migration task, you've documented, you tested, and you realize, oops, it's going beyond our allowable downtime. Let's go back to the drawing board and see what other strategies we can use in order to minimize downtime, right? And again, there's so much that I could really talk about this, but the main idea is to have a written, something that everybody agreed on, the allowable downtime. And like I said, I keep going back to the story that I mentioned earlier, where one of our clients, they decided they want to upgrade the storage. We're not even talking about upgrading Windows, upgrading SQL Server. No, they just want to upgrade the storage. It's a SQL Server failover clustered instance, and we were not given any clue at all about the project. They just said the vendor will come in, they will replace the storage area network, and then they will hand it over to you and move on. We had an 8-hour maintenance window, 8 hours. We have gone past the 6th hour, and the storage vendor still could not finish the entire migration. Weird. The CIO had to step in and say, roll everything back. Because, yeah, that's 75% of the time trying to do the migration, yet the vendor hasn't really made any progress yet. So they said, okay, let's roll back. 75%, we're cutting too close. And we technical professionals will do everything that we can in order to move forward, even though it's already getting close to the allowable downtime. CIO stepped in and said, roll everything back. Well, the vendor didn't have any option. They rolled it back. Unfortunately, the rollback didn't work. That's when we had to step in and try to fix things around. And again, we did not even know what to expect, because we're not even given the project plan. All we were told was, you got to be there for standby, and in case something happened, you have to step in. That's what we did, right? Cut close. They rolled back, didn't work. We fixed it before the 8-hour maintenance window. Everything's back to normal, but then the upgrade project, the migration of the storage, didn't happen. So you have to be clear about this from the get-go, in beginning, defining your recovery point objective, recovery time objective, so that your entire project will be based on the time that you are allowed to do it. Especially when you're tired, you're exhausted, and you're cutting close. People's ability to do work diminishes the more time they spend working, especially if it's more intensive and more analytical, the things that you're doing. Okay, so that's allowable, and you have to consider your downtime before. And I say before because, again, earlier today I said I'm not a big fan of in-place upgrades. So even if you're doing a side by, in my case, I would rather do a side by side. I want to know, will I incur any downtime before the actual cutover? My goal? Nope. I don't want to do. Nope, I don't want to do that. I don't want to risk it. So as much as I can, I don't want any downtime before. That's why I'm a big fan of side-by-side migrations. Something goes wrong, my main production environment is not affected. I can continue doing what I'm doing, rewrite my plan if I need to, change some strategies, but at least my production environment is not affected. Like during, this is when you're doing the production cutover. This is when you start doing the migration, everything. And of course, if you have your project timeline, if you have your project plan with all the duration and you've tested it, you kind of have an idea of how long it is going to take. And then after, right, when you start to stabilize, because I've seen cases where, yay, 4 hours in after production cutover, everybody's happy, you can all go to bed. On the 5th hour, it went down because, well, somebody forgot to configure backups, and now the server went down. There was no backups, or there was no HA at all. And again, I was part of that team, so I kind of I was responsible for it. And that's the thing, the before, the during, and the after, making sure that everything is well taken care of, right? The biggest challenge that I see in this case is where a customer has been running on SQL Server 2012. They have availability groups in place, right? Or if they're coming from a SQL Server 2008 available clustered instance, they're moving to a SQL Server 2019 or 2022, and they need to be highly available at that point. What happens after? Are they exposed, right? Because you cannot add an existing AG to, or you cannot add a new AG to an existing AG, unless of course you're coming from SQL Server 2016 where you have distributed availability groups. But yet, in the process of you moving to the new environment and the cutover is already done, are you exposed? Meaning, do you have HA available or high available? Yeah, do you have high availability? Right. In that brief period of time, when something goes wrong, are you protected? Again, my goal is to make sure that the upgrade and migration project is successful while minimizing the risk. Even that small risk, 5 minutes of not having an HA, a standby partner for an HA solution, that is part of the risk. Okay. Now, how you may have done it before, you may have done a backup copy restore, taken a backup of the database, copied over to the destination, restore it, right? Including some form of a log shipping where, okay, we got to keep doing this because we want to cut short our maintenance window. You may have done it using log shipping or even database mirroring. If you have SQL Server 2005, you want to do it with database mirroring. I've done a couple of upgrade and migration projects in the past where I was using database mirroring from 2005 or 2008 to 2016. But again, part of that is also looking at it as a one-way street, meaning you're coming from an older version of SQL to a newer version of SQL, which means there's no going back. There is no going back, because now the database engine will upgrade the version of the database and everything else. So there really is no going back. And it's also one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of side by side, because now I can do that without affecting my entire production environment, right? Even if database mirroring is already deprecated, I can still leverage it as part of my database upgrade and migration project. I mean, it's a tool, right? Once I cut over to the new environment, I can let go and replace it with something else, like failover clusters with availability groups or any high availability option. Or if you decide you want to do standalone instance, you want to move to the cloud, you want to move to a platform as a service offering, go figure, you can still use this. Although again, the availability of the tools and the strategies will depend both on the source and the destination, right? That's why I went back to these, because, well, backup, copy, and restore will still work regardless of the version, right? There might be some intermediary step Like for instance, you're coming from 2005, you may have to migrate to 2014 before you can move on to take a backup, then before you move on to SQL 2022. There might be some intermediary step, but they still work, right? That's the thing here. They work. I'm not concerned about, do I have availability groups in SQL 2005? I'm not concerned about whether I have distributed availability groups in SQL 2012. These work. Tried and tested, okay? And it doesn't stop here. Like I said, there will always be newer versions of SQL Server, especially with how much Microsoft has kept on with all of these innovations, right? Every time that Microsoft would have a new version, well, in fact, you know, SQL Server 2022 was recently announced and made generally available at the past Data Community Summit, but they're already working with the next version of SQL Server, right? This is going to be a constant thing. And I don't actually recommend doing the upgrades every time Microsoft releases a new version. Again, it's all about balancing of your return of your investments, your time, money, resource, manpower investments in here. I would recommend skipping one or two versions even. Just make sure that you're making the most out of the investments that you've made on your licenses, on your infrastructure and whatnot. But you have to constantly think about this. Part of your annual planning process is to look at, what do I currently have at the moment? Do I have versions of Windows and SQL Server that are no longer under mainstream support? What do I do with it? Part of that will be to constantly plan for upgrade and migration. And when you start looking at all of these things, you need a better path, right? And you do it once, you already have a framework, a project plan of how you deal with it. But because of the evolving technology, you also need to constantly reevaluate whether what you've done in the past is still the same thing that would work. And like I said, one client I worked with a couple of years ago, they wanted to move to Azure, but they want to do a lift and shift. They had a 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica AG. But when they did the math and planned to do a lift and shift, I'm like, ooh, this is very expensive. I think it was 3 or 4 times more expensive than what they were doing on premises. And I asked them, why do you have an availability group in the first place? Yeah, it took them a while to kind of have that going back to the real reason why they had that in the first place. And then we re-architected the entire infrastructure so that they don't have to do a lift and shift, but still meet their overall objective of why they had the availability group in the first place. Okay, so you have a project plan based on what you've done in the project and upgrade and migration project timeline. You have that, and because this is going to be a regular thing, maybe every 4 years, every 5 years, you revisit that. But then the target, let me throw it back there. How do I prepare for migration, or how do I help my customers prepare for migration? Is planning. That's why if you go back to the upgrade and migration project timeline, I spend a lot of time helping customers on the pre-upgrade and migration stage. The planning based on what I've seen in the field, based on what I've helped other customers, I incorporate all of that while at the same time also not over planning. You got to strike a balance, right? I think I posted, I think I shared it on social media the other day. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, meaning, well, you'll never know how your plan would look like until you start executing. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of in-place upgrades. Because with in-place upgrades, well, yeah, there's risk. Whereas when you're doing side-by-side upgrades and migration, right, I can test my entire project plan. I can time it. I can make modifications depending on the outcomes, and then redo it again until I'm like, okay, I'm confident. Let's do a production cutover. Okay, of course, not overspending more time, money, and resources doing it over and over and over again, because you're only going to do it once, right? But again, going back to the goal, making the upgrade and migration project successful while minimizing the risk. And that's why I spend so much time on the planning phase. And in the planning phase, I look at the destination, I look at the content, I look at the identification, and I look at the availability. These are the four things that I take into account when I'm doing both an upgrade or a migration project. And these are the very things that I help my customers work with whenever I help them build a plan. Of course, it goes beyond building the plan, right? That's why I said not a big fan of in place upgrade or migration. I'm more of a side by side thing. Create the plan, test the plan, iron out the wrinkles in the plan, and then do the production cutover, making sure that the plan is successful, the project is successful while minimizing the risk, meaning minimizing changes to application compatibility, minimizing downtime, minimizing the risk, minimizing the effort down the road. Because again, uh, you are going to have to do this again within the next 4 or 5 years. So I need to make sure that I can still reuse the project plan for the next 4 to 5 years whenever a new version of Windows or SQL Server will be made available, or when the time comes that I need to move off of that version because it's time for me to no longer have to support it. Because the last thing I want is to be running a platform or a version that Microsoft no longer supports, right? And this is how you kind of like a strategy of how you can eliminate the headaches of upgrading and migrating your SQL Server databases. And it's interesting, as I was going through this, I see a few comments in here where you can take into account all of these things that could potentially cause some issues and headaches when you're doing an upgrade or a migration project with your databases. And that's about it. That's about all I have today. And if you need help with stuff like, yeah, we are moving into a new version, we're trying to upgrade, and you need help, reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. We can talk about all these four components, right? What are your considerations? Where are you coming from? Where do you want to go as far as the destination of your upgrade and migration projects are concerned? And then look into how we can make that possible, right? And if you need my help in making that possible, again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have that conversation. I'll be happy to help you with your upgrade and migration projects, all right? And with that, that wraps up this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Tune in again next week. I mean, I got a couple of topics based on my conversations with people who attended the past summit and some of the interactions I've had with customers. Enjoy the rest of your week. I will see you again next time. And again, tune in to another episode. If you have any other questions, you can use the comment section. Post your comments. I'll respond to them as soon as I do get them. All right. And hopefully you're not doing any migration, because again, we're coming close to the holidays. Typically, this is most environments have a change freeze time during the holidays, and they usually take this take advantage of this time to do something like an upgrade or a migration project, right? And like I said, if you need help with any of that, use the link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help. All right. Enjoy your weekend. I'll see you again next time.